Hello, my name is Josh Sawyer. I'm the studio design director at Obsidian Entertainment, and I was the director of Pentiment. I've been talking for a while about doing a talk about OEI tools, which is Obsidian's proprietary tool set, and how we used it for Pentiment, among other things. I have not yet done a proper write-up for a talk on this, but I've been putting it off for months now while I do other talks. So I decided that I would just do a run through kind of ad hoc about one of the more complicated conversations in the game, which is the Golden Hand in Act 2. Just to give you a sense of how the tool works, and maybe that'll prompt some questions, and then I can write a more proper talk. Also, I should say that Carrie Patel and Dave Simchek gave a talk, I believe a half-hour talk at GDC on the tool set. I believe that's up on YouTube. But anyway, yes, so this is the standard view. It is customizable for OEI tools. This tool set was initially I designed it back in 2006 because I believed that we should move away from what I called cascading tree style dialogue editors that, where each branch kind of went down like a cascading tree, and into a visual flowchart more like, Project or Visio or something like that. So that is what we did, and then we've been using it ever since on at least all the projects we've worked on since about 2008. And it's just added more features, and we've had more designers contribute ideas to it, and it's very robust. And now I'll just kind of talk about it to give you an idea of how it works. And then, yeah, if you have questions, then post them in the comments. And from those comments, I can generate hopefully a more comprehensive talk. But like I said, I just wanted to get something moving on this rather than put it off. So this is the view that you have of a given conversation. There's a lot of functionality in here, so I'm just going to talk about the basics. You have the view of the overall conversation that is here, and you can zoom in or zoom out as much as you want into the individual node and reply level. Everything flows top to bottom, left to right. So, it's going to start evaluating nodes for validity up here. And the way that the logic works is if there's any sort of conditionals on these, then it will test for validity. And if it's not valid, then it will drop to the next. Did I skip one? No, it'll drop to the next one and evaluate and drop to the next one. This conversation is actually different because the way that you get into the conversation is through scripting. So it's a little unusual because these are all script nodes rather than conditionals, but that is the way it typically works in a conversation. In here, because this is super comprehensive of so many different conversations that happen within the Golden Hand, we have organized them using these color groups. So here you can see this is the intro to the Golden Hand. This is where Hannah, who is the wife of the proprietor, and Andreas talk to the crowd about the toast and the free drinks for everybody. And Samuel Grau, the Landsknecht, and how he gets introduced. Just one moment here. And how he gets introduced, that happens here. And then we have the doctor's convo, which is extremely comprehensive, the card game. But yeah, once you get into a conversation, then it flows left to right. And whenever you see these, I believe they're blue, I'm colorblind, but whenever you see these, those are nodes spoken by NPCs. Whenever you see these, which are in blue, these are replies. These are spoken by the player, in this case, Andreas. When you see a stack of them like this, that means that each one of these that is valid will display, and the player gets to pick between them unless there's just one, in which case it just moves forward. So in this case, Hannah is asking Andreas to talk to the crowd to tell them why they're drinking. And this node just goes into Andreas's options. So he can say, Otto was a good man. Otto was an ordinary man like any of us. Otto could be an asshole. And then that branches in turn into more options. So he stuck up for the people in this town. He hated the abbot and the abbey. He was a fine carpenter like his father before him. And then you're going to see that there are some conditionals on here. So for example, Andreas can attempt to seduce Ava, who is Otto's wife in the first act. You can bring up, and he even got over the fact that I tried to seduce his wife. This will give you negative reputation with Yosua, so scripting can be done within these nodes to move them forward. These are all open, so if you didn't actually seduce Otto's now wife or try to, then this won't show up. So the conditional is over here, is global value Andreas Ava flirt level greater than or equal to, let's see, what was the value? 3. If it's greater than that, then you're not going to see it, or you will see it, sorry. And if it's not, then you won't see it. And then, yeah, it flows left to right and continues until you hit a node that drops. That's typically the way it happens, is when you reach the end of a thread, it'll just drop off. We also have scripting nodes in here. These are things typically where cutscene animations and things play. So Andreas goes through this whole section, and then he says to Otto, and then Matthew Loyola and the animators set up all the animations so everyone takes a drink. Father Thomas can talk about it being a feast day, or it's not a feast day. In this case, you'll see that these are not exclusively conditionalized, because I don't want to make, this doesn't need to be exclusive. Basically, either it is a feast day, and if it is not the feast day, then we always want this to play. So it drops through. It says, if this, then play it. If not, drop through to the next one. So yeah, once you get to the end here, it drops off. Then Andreas is free to explore the bar and can talk to whoever he wants to. And that will in turn prompt different conversations. Here you can see Samuel Grau, the Landsknecht. So when you first come into, where do you come into this? Jeez, this is a really big conversation. So you come into the card game and you start talking to Samuel. He asks you if you want to play Landsknecht, the game. And you're going back and forth with some of the kids from the town. So you can see Samuel is here, also Hans. Excuse me. And at a certain point, Casper gets involved. He's your apprentice. You go back and forth a little bit. So he's asking like, hey, do you want to, Samuel is saying, hey, do you want to become a Landsknecht? And Casper is taken aback, and you can say, oh, he's my apprentice. Well, are you tired of being my apprentice? Or say nothing. Then Samuel and Casper kind of go back and forth. You can give so here you can see there are some conditionals that are being checked. We're playing Landsknecht. If you have been to France, then you can say, yeah, I've played that before. I played it with some soldiers and tours. If you're a hedonist, you can say, oh, I played that in some brothels. If you're a rapscallion, you can say, oh, I played that with some mercenaries. Or you can say, I'm not familiar with the game. You can say that even if you have these unlocked. Then Samuel says, no, that's, you haven't played my version. Do you want to? Then there's scripting here that will launch into the cutscene, even though scripting is not needed. In fact, the scripting is done. So, and then when you go into the actual card game, then we go to the card game itself. And the card game is fairly structured. So you go into the mini game. Samuel explains the basics. Rules are simple enough. Pay attention, boys. And then this is where the programmers have a hook to do the tutorial deck. This is not a normal game dealing hand. It's dealt for the sake of the player learning. So Samuel mentions the things that are happening. And yeah, then it plays through. And then as each card is, or as each hand is played, there are conditions that can be met to hit other nodes that the programmers link into. So for example, if you beat everyone, then game success. Andreas won, well played, you've taken us all. Casper is super impressed. He says you must be the best card player in the world, and you can talk about that. If you look, then you can either say, not my day, it's all, and then Casper's like, it's okay, Master Andreas. Or if you have Lawrence's pin from the first act, which we say you have it, then you can hawk your pin, give it up and get money for it and keep playing. And then there's a natural progression. So Hans can ask if they can get some beer. That leads to a hint about one of the suspects in the murder. Other conditionals. So the deck is exhausted, a player drops out. If a queen gets dealt, then Fabian will ask why the queen is rated higher than the king. If a bower gets played, then which just means farmer, Hans will say, why are they called farmers? Just little things like that. So these are all things that scripting can hook directly into. Now I'm going to show, and this will be the last thing I talk about because it'll be a while, and that hopefully will give you enough ideas of just the overall structure of the editor. I can also talk about all this crazy stuff up here. There's lots of functionality up here. But when you talk to the doctors, so there are, sorry, let me back up. There are 3 Italian doctors, and they are talking to Werner Stolz. And the doctors, I did this to be, honestly, I did do this to kind of be clever or try to be clever, and I wanted biting me in the ass. So there are 3 Italian doctors, and they speak Italian and they speak Latin. So if you speak Italian or Latin, because you have the Italy background or the Latinist background, then you can talk to them entirely in that language, and it gets translated as you go through each node. However, if you don't speak those, then you at least speak French through process of elimination, and you also may speak Dutch, and you also may speak English. And each doctor speaks French or Dutch or English of the 3 doctors. And so you can get this very convoluted flow through the conversation. So just to kind of show how that goes, when you start the conversation, Werner begins in Italian. Mark Antonio, who's one of the Bolognese doctors, he also speaks in Italian. Then you come up and Werner is either already insulted by Andreas, or he's not, and then he can introduce you to the group. And he kind of he doesn't want you to show him up. So there's a delicate balance here, because if you show off too much with the doctors, then Werner gets very self-conscious and petty and won't help you. So he introduces you, and he introduces you in Italian, and then Werner says to you, hey, this is Mark Antonio Orsi, Vincenzo Ambrosi, and Angelo Carni, and they're doctors from Bologna traveling to Flanders. Then we start setting paths. So we look at the players' backgrounds. Oh, man. So we say, oh, we do check to actually see if Werner has eaten with Andreas. And if he has, then there's a brief intro there. Then you will say something in Latin to introduce yourself. And then Mark Antonio expresses admiration for the fact that you speak Latin. And then you start speaking in Latin. If you speak Italian, then that sets that, and you can go through it that way. God, this is crazy. Doctor languages, indeed. And I'm afraid I don't speak any Italian, and my Latin isn't that good, but it's a pleasure to meet you. Mark Antonio will say, and it'll be translated or not based on whether or not you have the Low Countries background. So he will say, none of us speak German, but I do speak a little Dutch. And then you can say, oh, I speak Dutch. Or you can say, oh, I don't know Dutch. You speak German natively, so you recognize that it's Dutch, but you're like, I don't speak it. And then Vincenzo will say, Angela and I don't speak Dutch. Do you speak French? And so I have a note here. So you can leave notes. Notes are very handy. It's logically impossible for Andreas to not know French. So we don't conditionally check. We just know that you don't speak, or that you do speak French, so you can say that. And then Angelo will speak, he speaks English. And there's a trick here because the game was written in English, so it's hard to convey that he's speaking a language that Andreas doesn't understand. So I actually wrote it in English translated to like phonetic German. So it's the idea is you're hearing these sounds in English, but your German ear tries to make it German, which might not seem like it makes much sense, but that's why he says it this way, and it gets translated for you. And you can say, oh, I know English as well. And then based on that, it will go into the, it'll then actually go into the conversation itself. God, where does it go in? Okay, so here's where you actually start talking about natural history. And the flow is written so that there is a, oh geez, hold on. Okay, so you start talking about natural history, and there is always a Latin path and an Italian path. And then there's also the French path. And the way that the French path, French plus other languages path works is that they speak in Italian. And then because Vincenzo speaks French, he will summarize to Andreas and say, hey, Andreas, we're talking about Pliny's natural history. Do you know it? And then Werner's talking in Italian. And then if Angelo knows that you speak English, he will chime in with something in English. And if Mark Antonio knows that you speak Dutch, then he'll chime in with something in Dutch. But otherwise, it falls through to the French and it keeps going. And then you can respond and keep flowing through the conversation. And this gets actually even more convoluted, and I'll show you why. Hopefully I'll show you why, just a second. So, oh, I bet you can't see it. Basically, yeah, this would be a good one for me to set up in the full talk. But in other languages, like if you're playing the game in Italian, then the Italian strings that the doctors say are also translated into phonetic German. And if you're playing in French, then the French lines that Vincenzo says are translated into phonetic German. It's quite convoluted. It was a lot of fun, but that's some of what the tool does, just to give you a sense of how it works and flows. It's a very, very brief overview. I've already talked for 25 minutes, which is crazy. I could talk for a million years about this stuff because it's very complicated and there's a lot to the tool. So if you found this interesting or confusing or whatever, post some questions and ideas. Yeah, you can see here how the paths get really complicated. This was the most complicated, not necessarily the best, but the most complicated conversation to write. So yes, if you have questions about this, let her rip, and I will try to construct a more thoughtful talk about this in the future. Thank you.